Okay, so here I am in an old Defender to talk about the new Defender, or as many call, the Pretender. I'm getting a bit bored of going onto forums and people deliberately taking pictures and being demeaning of the new Defender, and I'm going to explain why in a few ways. Why I think it is, and why it will stop eventually, because it has to. For most people, some people will just carry on and on and on and on until everybody drowns in their own vomit, or their vomit. But I am in an old Defender. This is a 300 TDI, but notice it has a Puma steering wheel. It has Exmoor trim leather seats. Under here is a lot of Dynamat. Under here is a lot of Dynamat. In here are the foam water shedders of Puma Defenders. And there's a reason for that, because things evolve, things move on. And this is where the problem lies, in that if you look at cars that have been around for a long time, and there are quite a few, I suppose the Mini springs to mind, but the one that has been around for such a long time, so many generations, so many iterations, and has survived different models within the same company's lineup, is the Carrera or the 911. The differences really are down to two things. One of them is that the 911 is made in Germany, and it's made by Germans. And the Defender was made in the UK, and for a period of time was owned by British Leyland, and then it's been owned by a string of different people who have invariably done things to it. It's a bit like a town that went through lots of different hands. They would have, if London had been sold to everybody who had money who came to London, by now there would be no St. Paul's Cathedral, but there would be some dreadful monstrosity there instead. And there is the big difference, because not only do you have that difference in ownership, which basically meant that the Defender stayed in time, but also that there were no kind of incremental gains with which to improve your Defender. I suppose you could say you could put a TD5 engine into a 300 TDI. You could put a 300 TDI into a 200 TDI. There weren't huge improvements, like, for example, the generations of the flat six of the 911. But you don't notice the huge differences and jumps that you would necessarily from the versions of the flat six that you see people like Singer and Rennsport swapping out the components for within the flat six of a 911. And if you look at the latest iteration, then it had a Ford Transit engine, which is, I don't know what it is, but it's certainly not a step forward. You don't see anybody or hear of anybody with a 300 TDI or a TD5 wanting to put a Puma engine in their Defender. Before that, you'd put a BMW engine in, which is part of its lineage, or you put an OM606 or OM605 Mercedes engine in, but you would not evolve. But with the 911, you would. And the reason for that is, I think, if we look briefly, yes we must, at the 911. I've done this lovely little printout, which I wasn't beckoning on the steering wheel for. But you can see we have gone pretty much, every part of a decade we have made improvements. And along the way, there are people who have had a hissy fit. For example, here, when we went from air-cooled to water-cooled, I mean, people have really lost it. And the problem is, with the Defender, is essentially we have gone from here to here. if the 911 we had gone from here to here, then we'd probably have the same problem that we have today of people really not getting the difference between the old Defender and the new Defender. Having said that, I do have a few problems with the new Defender. They're not with the new Defender per se, it's how it's evolved. And I have the same problems with the 911. So, for example, this Defender, I can go through the width restrictions in Albert Bridge Road, on the Albert Bridge Road, in third. I can't do that in any modern car, let alone a modern Defender. And in a Range Rover or a Discovery, I would probably have to go through in first, crawling, with all the alarms going off. And the same is true of the 911. The old 911 is beautifully small, beautifully compact, very light, can be made even lighter. And the modern 911 is a big fat modern car. But with the Defender, there are more practical issues that are a problem. So if you look at the new one, when I printed these off rather than going through a screen, I thought they'd be nice and touchy-feely and give me a bit of a crib sheet, because there are so many versions of the 911 that you really need a crib sheet. But I wasn't betting on the steering wheel being in the way. But that's the difference between theory and practice. In theory, they're both the same. Practice are very different. But the other day, I was with my Defender outside a dealership with pretty much that Defender, that colour, etc. And the one thing you'll notice is, and what my daughters love doing, and the reason I fell in love with the Defender in the first place, is that you can step on here, to step on here, to step on there. And the Defender tries to keep those design briefs by having a checker plate there. I haven't checked to see if it's faux checker plate or real checker plate. But this is beside the point. Because it's a very high car, there is no way you can actually get up there. The only way you can get up there on the old Defender is by climbing on the bumper, which this doesn't have, and getting up there. I suppose you could have some kind of steps that go on the wheels that some people had for the Defender, but it's not the point. And so ultimately some of the things disappear. But the key thing that I haven't gone over so far is that it keeps the Defender alive. If you look at cars like the Morris Minor, okay, people will say it's not as iconic, but there are better examples I could come up with. The point being that once a car, no matter how long it's been going, and possibly even the Beetle has been going for a long time, but the new incarnation is not really like the old one, and I don't even know if the new one's made anymore, but nobody cares about the Beetle anymore. You can't get parts for the Beetle anymore. You can get all the parts you need for a 911, and for a Defender, my God, I mean, you can have anything you want shipped next day. Pretty much, if you wanted to buy a whole car in components, you could have it shipped the next day and start building it up. And that is because the spirit of the Defender is still alive. There's a lot of them still on the roads, but in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if there wasn't a new Defender, that would dry up. And if there isn't that carry-on ability, then things will dry up. And this is where I hope the Grenadier comes in. Because if the Grenadier uses a lot of the parts that the original Defender uses, or they can be upgraded to, then you will keep those parts going. You will keep the legend alive for longer. It's going to be interesting. I don't really see that many parts going from this Defender to that Defender. But then this steering wheel is 10, 15, 20 years younger than this car. These seats are 20 years younger than this car. And who knows, there may be lots of people now wanting to put these wheels on their Defender. We may have lights that look like that on the Defender. It's all part of keeping the legend alive, and with that, keeping the residuals of your old Defender alive. So next time you want to criticize the Pretender, which is an easy target, I get it, just think, Do you want your present Defender to stay with all the parts that it needs, and when people see it, they recognise a modern legend rather than a dying duck? The answer is probably yes. And for that, no matter what the new Defender looks like, no matter what you think of it, it is important because it is keeping an icon alive. And that, to me, is everything.